failure. And we'll fix all this indentation. So how do I, this is wrong. Why?
Didn't you show a method to us in the text edit that shows like assert something equals?
OK, so good. So there is going to be some kind of assert method, but there's something just fundamentally broken about my code here, even though Xcode isn't yelling at me just yet. Yeah?
Account local variable with a setup method?
Exactly. So this is like CS 101 style stuff where I had created a local variable in the setup method, and that's not good enough because it's going to now go out of scope and I have no access to this thing. So what's the solution here? What's that? So I could pass in the pointer, but be careful. The whole goal of the testing framework is that each method is going to be called in isolation. So setup should not call my test methods. They'll be called automatically. Yeah, so I could make it a property, or at least I could make it a instance variable. So how can I do this? Well, I'll do it sort of the fancy, arguably well-designed way where I'm going to create an interface called the exact same thing, ATM logic tests, and it's a nameless category. And then I'm going to put n down here. And then in here I can do property. Let's come back to the parenthetical in a moment. And I want a property that's a pointer to an account. And then down in here I want to do synthesize account and back it with an instance variable called account. All right, now what should go in the parentheses here for this property? What 3 keywords are appropriate? What's that? OK, strong. Why? Good. I am going to allocate this as I do down here, so I should keep the pointer around with strong. What else? OK, so read. Got to pick one. Read only or read write? So read write, otherwise I won't be able to set it at all. And what's the other one? Yeah, so non-atomic, which just means I'm not doing anything multi-threaded. So those are the 3. There are defaults. Technically, we don't need read write, but this will do for now. All right, so this is some kind of private property for now. Could also go in our header file per the chat earlier. But now I just have to change this to be what? Self.account. Exactly. All right, so now this is good. Now my setup method is actually going to create this object in memory, call alloc and call init. So now my test balance should hopefully be able to test this method. So what's the actual routine here? Well, in test balance, I can go in here and I can use one of these assert methods, which in Objective-C is called st. It's always something st, assert true in this case. And just to give you a sense, notice you have a whole bunch. Assert that it's nil, assert that it's not nil, assert that it throws, something called an exception, assert true, assert false, assert equals, assert equals, assert equal objects. So in short, there's a whole bunch of assert methods that you can do. So I'll choose one of the simpler and most useful ones, assert true. And I want to assert that the account balance equals 0. And if it doesn't, I want a little comment to display on the debugger window, balance is not 0. So the syntax is a little different from my pseudocode earlier, but the st assert true literally is supposed to kill my program if the assertion that self.account.balance equals 0 is not true. And if it isn't true, what's going to happen is that string is going to get printed to the screen as a reminder to myself as to what this test actually was. So that's about all I can test in this particular example. And when I actually run this code, it will hopefully fail or not fail on me. Let me go ahead and switch to, let me just open one that also has some application tests ready for us. Actually, no, that's OK. We'll do this here. All right, so if I actually run this thing via test, first choosing ATM logic tests, now clicking test, whole bunch of things is going to fail here because I wasn't paying very close attention here. So we need to do a couple things like import account.h, property with retain or strong. There we go. Build failed. What I do wrong now? OK, so let me do this. This actually cost me an hour of my life last night. So hopefully it won't cost you yours. So Xcode is not the most perfect tool in the world. And especially when you start doing more sophisticated things like version control and also in this case unit testing, which should not be a huge leap, things start to break. And Stack Overflow will be your friend for this. So this is the error that I'm actually getting here. It has to do with the linker, which is the process in compilation whereby you take bits that you wrote and bits that someone else wrote, mash them together to actually have one final executable binary. In this case, I'm getting 2 errors here related something to, it looks like my class. It's kind of cryptically named because you typically get these somewhat random symbol names being generated from code that you write, but it clearly has to do with what? So it has to do something with account. It can't find my account code, even though I've imported the file and it's right there. I mean, it's literally in the same project. So frankly, some Googling led me to this resolution here. If you click on ATM at the top, which generally brings up all of the various esoteric properties, click on Build Phases. And then under Build Phases, you'll see Compile Sources here. And this is actually here now. Why? Oh, OK. So notice this, now I have my ATM target selected, which is the default. Before we ever started talking about unit tests, that thing was always there. If I choose ATM logic tests, notice what's missing. So account.m. So if I actually click the plus and then choose account.m, thereby adding a mention of the object code that I need to be included in this thing, thank God, this time it worked, test succeeded, and the fact that nothing happened is a good thing, right? That means literally test succeeded. So let's actually screw something up. Let me go into my logic test, and let me just assume that, you know what, my balance had better be $100 by default, even though that's definitely not to be the case. Let me go ahead and open up the debugger window in the bottom, just so we have something to look at. And now let me go ahead and click test. And again, notice we're not using run, we're using test. And in this case, build succeeded. Oh, test failed. And what actually failed? Well, notice here, if I click on the red at top left, self account balance equals 0 should be equals 100 should be true, but it's not. So what this means is that the compilation and execution of your program will literally be halted. You can't actually run it in the simulator because it's wrong. So the upside here is that you now know that you either just screwed something up, or when you just did a pull from your partner from Bitbucket, you know that he or she actually screwed something up. At which point, then you'll be pissed because then they have to go fix it or you have to figure out what's broken. But the upside is now that you know, and you can now have quantitative measures of just how correct or incorrect your code is. Now, what about the actual view controller code? There's a ridiculous amount of functionality we wrote to actually handle digits and deposits and clearing and whatnot. So again, let me do this. File, new, target. And I'm doing this again because I did not check that box initially 2 weeks ago to create unit tests. I'm going to call these ATM application tests and then click Finish. And now I get another folder down here, ATM application tests, just like before. If I click on the project itself, notice I now have 3 targets. And here too, let me teach you something that took me an hour. When you create, again, add unit tests to your project by way of the file menu that I just did, you get, again, these things called logic tests that will not spawn the simulator to actually run your code in an environment where you can test things about the UI. So you actually have to follow steps at that URL. Which will allow you to change the default setting of logic tests to something called application tests. And it really is more arcane than it should be. You have to copy and paste like an environment variable into a certain part of the compiler, into Xcode's UI. It's just a pain in the neck. So if you check that box when starting Project 2, like the spec told you to, you don't have to worry about that. Because you have application tests and adding logic tests is easy. But FYI, all your answers to all the problems I ran into are at this URL and Stack Overflow. And this lecture. All right, so how do we go about testing these kinds of things? Well, let's go ahead now into the ATM application tests file, which currently is empty. And let me start sketching out a couple of things that we might actually want to test. So we again have a setup method and a teardown method and a test example. And indeed, if I try running the test suite now with ATM application tests. So again, remember to change your target here. Let me run tests. Build succeeded, test failed. Why? Well, what does stfail do? It will always fail, right? This is there because hopefully you'll never get to this point in your code. The fact that I have means something's broken. Well, what's broken? Well, that's just because the template code they give me is meant to die, just to draw your attention to the fact that you need to actually write unit tests. And as an aside, in case you're thinking this is kind of stupid that to test your code you have to constantly change among these targets, realize that via this interface here, build phases and such, you can actually set up dependencies so that when you actually run your normal program, it will automatically run the tests for you and just won't run in the simulator until your tests pass. So it doesn't have to be as tediously manual with all the clicking that I'm doing here. All right, so back to the ATM application tests. What kinds of things might we want to test here? Well, a very common paradigm is to name your test methods after the methods that you're actually testing. So let's do an easy one. Let's go ahead and test the app delegate, which should hopefully be set up for me. So hopefully that will be an easy one to do. Let me go ahead and set up the framework for testing my clear method, so test clear. And notice these always return void and they never take arguments. That's just what the framework dictates. And then we'll do another one like void test deposit. And there's a couple others we could probably do. But these are all placeholders now for actual code. So how do I now get access to effectively my UI? Well, let me go into my setup method. As before, anytime you override a parent class's method, you should always call it via super. And in this case, what I'm going to do is this. I want to have around a pointer to all the interesting things that run a program. The app delegate pointer would be nice. What else is a big object that has to do with running apps? The view controller, and then the view controller has a view, a UI view, which is literally all the WYSIWYG things that I dragged and dropped into the UI, all the buttons and whatnot. I'd love to have the big rectangle that encompasses them all. So let me go up here and just have some properties declared so I can do that. I'm going to do it the fancy semi-private way. So interface, ATM, application tests, nameless class extension. Let me go in here and do a property, and the first property will be called app delegate. And then the next one will be view controller, star view controller. And you can call these things anything you want, but frankly, you'll stay more sane if you just use the camel case notation like this, so that they're consistently named. And then I'll want a pointer to a UI view. And then for each of these, let me go ahead and do non-atomic for all of them, which we keep doing. Let me go ahead and do read-write for all of them, even though that's the default. And then lastly, we have to answer the question of pointer. Should these be strong or weak? Someone say weak. Weak is correct. So why? Well, again, I being the class in which I'm typing right now, I am not going to allocate an app delegate. I'm not going to allocate a view controller. That's going to be done by the application itself. So in this case, I do not need to allocate those objects. Indeed, I will not call alloc. So we'll see how I get these pointers in actuality. So now let's actually do a quick synthesis of these. So a little tedious to type, but we'll just do app delegate is going to be backed by underscore app delegate. Synthesize view controller is going to be backed by underscore view controller. And then lastly, view is going to be backed by underscore view. And then up here, to make Xcode stop complaining, I'm going to have to go ahead and include my app delegate class. I'm going to have to go ahead and include my view controller class. And then that's it. I don't need to worry about UI view because I'm going to get that from some of the template code itself. All right. So in my setup code, how do I get access to these three important big objects? Well, I want to assign self.appDelegate to the result of calling UI application, shared application, delegate. So this method call returns effectively a pointer to the UI application that was created by main. If you think back to where the story always begins. And delegate returns a pointer to what? The app delegate, to whom UI application main, according to our story, delegated control. So this gives me a pointer to my own app's app delegate. How do I get access to the view controller? Well, self.viewController is going to get the return value of self.appDelegate.viewController. So why does this work? Well, recall the code that we keep taking for granted in appdelegate.m. In appdelegate.m, notice what it's doing. It's, yes, allocating the view controller, calling init with nib name, but where is it putting the return value? Well, there it is. Once I have a pointer to the app delegate, I can get a pointer to the view controller. So lastly, all we need is the sort of generic view that encompasses everything. So self.view, and this one's actually pretty easy. Self.view gets self.viewController. Take a guess. View. Now we have all three sort of macroscopic objects that are really interesting when it comes to my app's overall execution and its overall UI. So how do we test the app delegate? Well, this one's pretty easy, and frankly, it's probably not necessary to get into this habit, but let's just do it for good measure. stassert not nil, and then pass in what? Self.appDelegate, and then comma, cannot find the application delegate or some such string. So this will be a little sanity check to assert that indeed the app delegate exists. So let's do something more interesting now. How do I go about testing the clear method, that it actually works? Well, on a high level, how would you go about testing the notion of does your clear button work? What would you do in the real world? Yeah?
You call it and see whether it does what it's supposed to do.
OK, good. You call it, and then you see, or you press